Now that I think about it, making the first episode on Yordles was probably a mistake, considering Bandle City and its inhabitants aren't exactly very good first page material. So in light of that, I think it would be better to go back to square one and talk about one of the more prominent and established world powers in Runeterra. So welcome back to the second installment of my lore and gameplay fusion series, where I talk about groups of champions based on their place of origin. Today's faction will be Demacia. If you haven't watched the first video on Yordles, allow me to give you a quick recap on how this series works. For most of my content, I like to look purely at the gameplay side of League of Legends, but I do have a vested interest in lore and storytelling, especially within video games, because I feel like that's an unexplored area of the entire industry as a whole. So I'll begin with a bit of exposition of the region in question, followed by the champions currently residing there, as well as those affiliated with it. Then I'll look at the playstyle similarities between the champions that reflect their culture and personalities, followed by talking about something I think would be cool to discuss before giving my final thoughts on the faction at the end of the video. So let's get started. Demacia's role in League of Legends is largely archetypal in nature just by looking at it. Every game universe has that one good guy nation that stood apart from the bad guy nation since time immemorial. We can draw a parallel to World of Warcraft with the Alliance versus the Horde. Alliance being the land of elves, humans, dwarves, and so on, and has a strong sense of order, society, and tradition. Their values are often found on moral principle and represent the old-fashioned medieval Europe or feudal Japan with kings, queens, knights, nobles, aristocracy, and most importantly, the established social hierarchy. Then we have the Horde, which belongs to the orcs, trolls, goblins, the monsters basically. They extol strength and merit, where people determine their worth not by birth or station, rather their own capabilities, achievements, and ambitions. This is due to the faction being founded through survival, mostly in defiance towards the established order of their opponents. Demacia and Noxus live up to that trope almost literally. A strong, lawful kingdom with a prestigious military history, Demacia's people have always valued the ideals of justice, honor, and duty most highly and are fiercely proud of their cultural heritage. However, over the years as the League of Legends universe continued to develop and expand, the lore revealed the darker side of this supposed bastion of moral virtue. Originally, the capital was established as a place of asylum during the Rune Wars, built upon the riddle of Petricite, a white stone that acts as sort of a lightning rod for magic. Based on this, the people of Demacia have been raised on folktales and stories about dark mages and potentially world-ending events because of magic. And in the wake of how the country was formed, magic was seen as a forbidden and destructive force, existing only for the purposes of self-annihilation. This anti-mage sentiment has given rise to what can only really be described as Runeterra's version of the Holocaust: systemic expulsion, subjugation, suppression, and in some cases extermination of anyone discovered or suspected of magical properties. If you're interested in knowing more about this, I suggest you take a look into Silas's backstory, as there's an entire subplot made around his imprisonment and eventual revolution against Demacia, which signaled a wave of change and reform to dismantle the nation's archaic laws and regulations. It's a pretty interesting read, and also explains why Lux evades persecution despite being a mage herself. If you also want to know how Sona isn't hunted down by mage seekers, that's elucidated within her own background too. But for the sake of this video, that's as far as I'm gonna go. Essentially, Demacia is an old-fashioned medieval kingdom that you would expect to see in a lot of 2000s games. They have a strong sense of duty, honor, nobility, and bear hatred towards magic and all who possess it on a societal and cultural level. I went into that much detail about the land because these ideals are physically represented in the League of Legends game as well. In fact, Demacia may be the most homogeneous nation in Runeterra in terms of their citizens. As of making this video, there are 15 representatives which you can see on screen right now. At first glance, the champions of Demacia may appear to not be as alike to one another compared to other regions like Freljord or the Void from a gameplay standpoint anyway. But it's important to make the distinction between the quote-unquote humans and then the non-humans. Kayle, Morgana, and Shyvana are listed in Demacia, but given their appearance you can draw the conclusion that their affiliation is only by name. For Kayle and Morgana, they're children of a Targonian aspect, tasked to protect Demacia as guardian angels of sorts. I mean, they look the part. As for Shyvana, she's a half-dragon, so she's obviously not Demacian or human by birth. That leaves the rest of the gang, and this is where we talk about everyone looking more or less the same. Those who are actively within the nation's military or participating noble classes are Fiora, Garen, Jarvan IV, Lux, Poppy, Quinn, and Xin Zhao. Demacia's values of protection and defense reflect quite considerably on their attire. Garen, Jarvan, Poppy, Xin Zhao, they're sporting some pretty sturdy tech. Even Lux and Shyvana have no shortage of armor. Quinn is an exception, although due to her role as a scout/hitman and not an active combatant, her light attire is justified. Having looked at the roster as a whole now, I'm honestly pretty surprised at how consistent Riot was with each individual champion. Other than reworks though, the most recent champion to come out for this faction was Sylas after many years of no new releases. I think that was done intentionally though. In the beginning, Demacia was foundational to shaping the League of Legends universe, so they laid the groundwork for Runeterra. The country itself is also rather insular, not taking too kindly to strangers, and from what I can infer, they rarely engage in commerce or politics with other nations. That would explain why there's not that much room for champion crossovers. In recent years, we've seen a lot of wandering types, characters who've originated from one place but have since immigrated to others either by choice or circumstance. As an example, Zamira is from Shurima but now hangs around in Noxus as a bounty hunter. Set is half Noxian, half Vestian, so he has ties to Ionia. Senna was born somewhere outside of Demacia but now is tied to the Shadow Isles. Kayn was born in Noxus but now hangs in Ionia, things like that. Sona and Poppy would be the only ones to my knowledge who were outsiders of Demacia who have since then moved there, but those two are very old releases. At first, I thought it was mere coincidence that Riot wanted to make champions for other reasons, but it may have been on purpose. Demacia is deteriorating from its aging traditions and obstinance towards maintaining things as is. Not by any fault of their own, mind you, it's just they don't know any better. That was the driving motivation for Sylas's rebellion. You can also see their behavior and attitudes very conspicuously in-game, namely in how they approach combat. Demacians aren't one for cheap tricks and deception, choosing instead to engage their opponents head-on. And the first thing to make note of is that within the nation's military, none of its members have any form of stealth or on-target ability. Rather, what they do have in common is an outlet of protection, which is what separates Demacian champions from that of Noxus or other factions. To some extent, this extends even to those not in service. Barring Lucian, Sylas, and Shyvana, everyone has at least one ability to their name that can be used for self-heal or defense. Even among the exceptions, Sylas's Kingslayer can sustain himself, albeit only when used offensively, and Lucian does have the ability to dash away. I wouldn't go so far as to say Demacia is the faction with the highest overall defense in the cast. That would have to go to Freljord given the sheer amount of tanks originating from there, but defense as a whole is a defining element for their nation. Something else you might find quite interesting is the unusually high number of AP ratios among its physical damage dealers, which one would find rather strange since Demacia is anti-magic. The reason behind this is quite simple. Alongside the country's infrastructure and cities, most equipment and weaponry were also made with Petricite, allowing them to absorb magic. It's not unreasonable for elements of magic to be ironically present in anyone wearing armor or wielding armaments forged from magical stones. As a result, almost every champion with a notable weapon of some kind has an AP scaling component in their kit. Fiora's Riposte, Jarvan's Demacian Standard, Lucian's Ardent Blaze, Poppy's Steadfast Presence, although she's a Yordle so I don't think that really counts, and Xin Audacious Charge. The only real inconsistency in this is Garen, who doesn't have an AP ratio in his kit. A running meme about him is that he's the most anti-magic person in Demacia, yet he summons a magical sword with its ultimate. I'm not too sure about that one myself, but at the same time these AP ratios are not really meant to serve any purpose in game, as you wouldn't be building ability power on those champs anyway, more of a narrative touch you can call it. Now before we go any further, I want to talk about the three mages of Demacia since they paint an obvious contrast. Even though they're users of magic, Sylas, Lux, and Sona still adhere to the traditions and cultures of their upbringing. The former two were born and raised there, while Sona was adopted at a young age and assimilated the customs of Demacia. Due to this, their usage of said magic is also largely straightforward, bearing some semblance of self-defense or survivability rather than being explicitly for offense or control like mages in other places. Sylas was a victim of Demacia's eradication of mages, but despite rebelling against his homeland, there's a strong sense of the nation within him demonstrated by his simple yet honest kit. No one in Demacia fights dirty. Regardless of what your opinions are of the faction, you gotta at least respect that you don't need to put up with any dumb shenanigans against them. Except for Vayne, but screw her. One other thing, to my knowledge, Demacia is the only major faction in Runeterra to not have any assassins, as the class's way of fighting inherently goes against the nation's principles. There is a certain charm to a country whose entire gimmick is about being straightforward and homogeneous. At times it may give way to some redundancies here and there, but by doing so, it ensures a standard of clarity. Among many other things, one faulty aspect of new League champions is the ostensible absence of design boundaries. It's what's causing champions from Ionia, the land of balance, to be so imbalanced. Therefore, if you establish a code of conduct, it lowers the risk of going too far in how you design a champion's limitations. By the way, full disclosure, I'm not implying champions from Demacia are necessarily balanced or fair. It doesn't matter which country I talk about, there will always be stupid BS. However, Demacia is one of the more controlled and stable factions in the game, stable in the sense that no matter how strong the likes of Jarvan, Morgana, Galio, Fiora, Lucian are, they still have a major weakness or deficiency you can exploit, because they don't have an ability or playstyle that can nullify entire forms of counterplay purely by virtue of it existing. To elaborate, let's look at Fiora's Riposte. It's a very notorious ability, especially among top laners. For 3/4 of a second, she becomes immune to any and all hostile interactions besides towers before throwing a skill shot in a straight line that damages all enemies hit, slowing and crippling the first enemy champion along the way. During the casting animation, if she's hit with any form of hard CC, that slow and cripple instead becomes a stun. So many players complain about Fiora's ability to counter any champion with predictable hard crowd control like Kled, Aatrox, Urgot, Camille, etc. But it's a reactive ability in nature, so the onus falls on the Fiora to time a successful parry for the stun. And even if she does, she still has to land the skill shot, which if her opponent is smart with their movements, they can easily dodge that ability. Most Demacians have reactive defense, not proactive defense. Assuming you're on a level playing field, these abilities are meant to be used in response to enemy attack. If used correctly, they can save you or your team from serious trouble. Misposition or mistime them, and some of them can put you in an even worse position than you were before. That's what separates Demacian champion Self-Peel from other regions like Noxus and Ionia. Akali's Twilight Shroud can be used to buy her time, but it's mostly used to guarantee that her target won't be able to do anything to stop her from 100 to 0ing them. Cassiopeia's Miasma can be used to slow down pursuers, but most of the time she uses it to prevent you from escaping while she relentlessly pelts you with Twin Fangs. Providing no concessions for dirty fighting also implies Demacia cannot and will not ever have an assassin champion, which, as we know, is the most aggravating class to deal with. Before you run off in the comments saying Quinn, Fiora, or Sylas is an assassin, just cause you get one-shotted by someone does not mean they're an assassin, okay? I know you're an ADC main. You probably lose 1v1 to Leona or Nautilus, let alone those three. Anyways, the Slayer category has no shortage of 200 years champions, and it just so happens that most of the new champions like Gwen, Viego, and Yone are Slayers. With all that said though, their greatest strength might also be their greatest weakness. It's important to honor the constraints you set up for a region, but much like how Demacia is starting to fall behind the times in the game's lore, it's falling behind a lot in gameplay too. One might go so far as to say the restrictions put on the faction are too strict, blocking Riot from being able to make fresh and interesting champions, because while we all like to complain about new champions being overpowered and broken, you can't lie, they're all really fun to play. In contrast, Demacian champions can get old rather quickly, with only a select few maintaining consistent presence regardless of the meta. Everyone else is only played when strong and never played when weak. What I'm basically trying to say is that Demacia is one of the more boring regions. They certainly don't have as much of a following as the likes of Noxus, Ionia, The Void, Bilgewater, Shadow Isles, and such. At the very least, you don't have as much creative agency to make innovative champions with new abilities. Sylas may have the potential to steal any ultimate from the enemy team, but his passive and basic abilities are pretty reminiscent of old school champions. Granted, his simplicity is probably what attributes to his massive popularity, but I can't help but feel like for him, those restrictions only chained him down. I wouldn't have minded if Riot tried something a little cool and wacky for someone whose MO is about dismantling the established order, even if it made perfect thematic sense for him to be simple. In the end, it comes down to perspective. Some may see Demacia's conservative gameplay as down to earth, living proof that champions can be straightforward and not have so many crazy mechanics like stealth, untargetability, or whatever that goes on in other places in order to be viable. Others might view Demacian champions as outdated and boring, choosing instead to go into more explosive and exciting characters elsewhere. Since I only made one other episode thus far, I can only compare Demacia to Bandle City, and while I do appreciate Demacia's unembellished design, there is such a thing as being too stringent. The past few years oversaw tremendous expansions within the League of Legends universe, and while the introduction of Sylas did shake things up a bit, I kinda have to agree with him when he says,
"How beautiful a world is without walls."
Anyway, that's gonna wrap it up for today. Sorry for taking so long to release the second episode. The lore videos require a bit more time to make as it's far more abstract in nature, but if you liked it, be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, or if you thought I could do something better, then I'd love to hear that too. For now, if you enjoyed the video, a rating would be much appreciated. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this, follow me on Twitter and join my Discord server, and if you haven't yet, make sure to check out my first episode on Yordles and Bandle City if you feel like it. Until then, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for the next episode. Take care.